Welcome back to Conflicts of Interest. This is episode 763, and today is February 26th, 2025. I'm the host of the show, Kyle Anzalone. A lot of news to go over on today's shows, especially about the war in Ukraine and how it may be coming to an end somewhat soon. This is potentially some very good news, although there are a lot of traps that remain, a lot of pitfalls that could get in the way of this deal getting done. So we'll be breaking that down on today's show. Share the show is hosted at the Libertarian Institute, and right now at the Institute, we are holding our fundraiser. So if you can, head on over and make a donation today. That helps us to, pay our staff to produce the content that comes out at the Institute. I mean, there are probably tens of thousands of articles now. I think right around 10,000 podcast episodes between all of the different programs that we produce. 16 books now have been published through the Institute, including Scott Horton's new Provoked, which you could get a signed copy of if you make a donation. So, a lot of reasons to support the Institute, and I definitely appreciate it when you all do that. Otherwise, you could just share out this show. It's hosted, or not hosted, it's hosted at the Institute, reposted on the blog at antiwar.com. We publish a video version at YouTube, Rumble, and Odysee. It's up anywhere you can listen to audio podcasts. And follow me on Twitter at @KyleAnzalone_. Last thing real quick here, subscribe to the Kyle Anzalone Show. That is the first link in the show notes page, and I will be putting out a new episode of that program later today. All right, let's get into it. So I think maybe the best news that I have seen from the Trump camp when it comes to talks about Ukraine is this: Ukraine war negotiations framed by Istanbul Protocol agreement. So President Donald Trump's Middle East envoy, Steve Witkoff, explained that talks on ending the war in Ukraine are in the Istanbul Protocol Agreement framework. That protocol refers to a deal that was nearly signed between Kiev and Moscow that would have ended the war in Ukraine within a few months. Witkoff gave multiple interviews on Sunday discussing ongoing negotiations about the war in Ukraine. He told CNN that a deal was very close and could be completed in the coming weeks. Witkoff said that the current talks follow the Istanbul Protocol agreement. This is the quote: "There was very, what I call continent and substantive negotiations framed in something that's called the Istanbul Protocol agreement. We came very, close to signing something, and I think we will be using that framework as a guidepost to get a peace deal done between Ukraine and Russia, and I think it will be an amazing day." So this is, I think, very important, because if I had a particular criticism of Trump's foreign policy the first time, it's that everything Trump said was, sometimes it sounded good, sometimes it sounded bad, but none of it really seemed to deal with the real issues, the core issues. It was just his thoughts of the day on a certain thing. Oh, I want to pull the troops out of Syria. Well, that's great, but the U.S. has been trying to regime change there for a long time, and so now to unwind that war, it's going to be far more complicated than just saying, I want the troops to come out. He's going to have to actually give orders and make sure that he has people in place to follow them. And, exit from countries are somewhat complex, and they take time and coordination and forethought. And these are things that just in the first Trump administration, he didn't seem to have. This, talking about the Istanbul Protocol agreement, I think shows a real depth of understanding of what's happening in Ukraine, how this war was almost ended, and a framework that could actually end this conflict. So I think this is highly encouraging. So I write, in March of April of 2022, the first months after Russia invaded Ukraine, U.S. allies Israel and Turkey hosted talks between Ukraine and Russia. In Istanbul, the two sides agreed to the outline of an agreement. Under the deal, Russia would withdraw from territory seized after the invasion in exchange for Ukrainian neutrality and limits on its military. In addition, Kiev would recognize Crimea as Russia, and its Western backers would lift sanctions on Moscow. However, Washington and London did not want the war to end so soon after the invasion and promised Kiev to provide Ukraine with all the support it would need to win the war. At the time, some members of NATO saw the war as an opportunity to use Ukraine to weaken Russia. In April of 2022, then UK Prime Minister Boris Johnson traveled to Kiev and informed Ukrainian President Zelensky that he would not receive Western support if he signed the deal with Russian President Vladimir Putin, but would receive weapons if he chose to go to war. In the following 2 years, Russia has annexed 4 additional regions of Ukraine. It is unclear how the current deal would differ from the initial Istanbul Protocol agreement, as Putin said Russia will not return the annexed territories. Since talks broke down, at least hundreds of thousands have died in the conflict, with President Trump asserting that the true death toll is in the millions. On Monday, Trump indicated he would be willing to lift sanctions on Moscow, or at least begin to normalize the economic relationship between the superpowers as part of a deal to end the war in Ukraine. He explained, "I am in serious discussions with President Vladimir Putin of Russia concerning ending the war and also major economic transactions which will take place between the United States and Russia. The talks are proceeding very well." U.S. and Russian officials are now scheduled to meet for another round of talks later this week. And so, I'm seeing all the steps needed here to produce an actual agreement. And so I see this piece of it all as highly encouraging. Now, we also have this. Earlier this week, Zelensky said, well, I will resign, and then Ukraine could get NATO membership, and this should make Trump happy, which was just an absurd idea. And it was thankfully ruled out pretty quickly by our national security advisor, Mike Waltz. And so that Waltz didn't, float this idea or suggest it is good, because this is clearly a red line for Putin. It doesn't necessarily matter who is in charge of Ukraine. He just doesn't want Ukraine to be a part of NATO. So speaking of the NATO alliance, there's some interesting meltdowns going on in NATO. Polish president, NATO without the US, what's the point? So the leader of Poland said that without the US, NATO is a pointless blot that would only have the illusion of power. The Polish president, Andrzej Duda, also said Warsaw would welcome American troops if Germany elected to expel them. So on Tuesday, Duda said, NATO without the United States, everything is possible, but what's the point? If there's a security alliance without the United States, then its guarantees without the world's strongest power would simply be illusory. So the remarks are an admission that NATO's power is underwritten by Washington, and without America's military might, the bloc lacks geopolitical power. President Donald Trump has frequently complained that the continent is largely dependent on Washington for its defense. Trump's position on Ukraine and his questioning of the alliance has created concern in European capitals. Friedrich Merz, a German politician who is expected to be the next chancellor of Germany, said Europe needs independence from America. He explained, "My absolute priority will be to strengthen Europe as quickly as possible so that step by step we can really achieve independence from the USA. I never thought I would have to say something like this on a television program, but after Donald Trump's statements last week at the latest, it is clear that the Americans, at least at this part of the Americans, this administration are largely indifferent to the fate of Europe." Merz's statement shows there are some divisions within the European community, as Duda said Warsaw would welcome the American troops if Germany pushed them out. So if Germany does not want American troops, does not want partnership with the United States, we will very willingly accept partnership with the United States. I am interested in transferring all cooperation that Germany has with the United States to Poland very willingly. During his first presidency, Warsaw attempted to court Trump into deploying more American troops to Poland by offering to name a new base, Fort Trump. And so, look, I think there's a couple of very interesting pieces to this. One is just the very frank admission by Poland of how critical the U.S. is to this alliance. This isn't something you often have admitted in Europe. Now, of course, this is in the context of Poland trying to pull American troops further to the east, which I think is the opposite direction that they need to be going. Of course, they need to be coming westward coming home. And so Germany expels them. Please do not move them into Poland. Do the opposite and just bring them back to the United States. But the, division in this block that, Lon said, oh, this is unity. This is, we can't question the alliance. We now see that there's all these fractures emerging. And so this is very important. Now, the last thing in the potential, I think, pitfall, and one of the reasons I really want to talk about this, is there is a risk that the U.S. troops move eastward, that it could be something that upends and upsets the negotiations going on with Russia. As I've said, I think the negotiations with Russia would probably benefit Ukraine more if the deal extends beyond just Ukraine, where, to be quite honest, I don't think the West has a whole lot to offer Russia. I think whatever Russia wants out of Ukraine, Putin is content on taking that through first military war of attrition, and then, finalizing it at the diplomatic table, but at the barrel of a Russian gun. He understands that the Ukrainians can only fight on so long, that Ukraine's Western backers could only pour in so much support, that Ukraine only has so many young men to pour into this conflict. And Russia simply does not have those constraints. And so in the long term, eventually Russia will continue to take territory, and eventually the Ukrainian military will be unable to fight and will collapse. And at that point, Russia will be able to dictate to Kiev just how much territory they end up taking and just what the conditions are for ending this war. And so that is one possibility for how this war ends. Another possibility is that the U.S. enters into negotiations with Russia now. And of course, they could probably make a deal to end the war in Ukraine that is limited to the war in Ukraine. However, Ukraine really has nothing to exchange Russia. A little bit of territory in Kursk, maybe. I'm sure accepting, no NATO membership, elections, and a few other things would make the Russians happy that they don't have to, do it all on the battlefield. But I think real concessions that the West could make to restore the balance of power in Europe could lead to Russia making concessions in Ukraine. And as I've said, military bases in Eastern Europe, particularly the missile bases in Poland and Romania, war games in the Black Baltic Sea on Russia's border are all things that I believe could be scaled back. Return or extension of international arms control agreements like the INF Treaty, the New START Treaty, are also things the U.S. should, I think, be floating here. Okay, so Putin says Trump's proposal to have military spending is a good idea. This is what I'm talking about. Russian President Vladimir Putin has backed a proposal from President Trump to cut military spending in half as part of a potential three-way agreement between the U.S., Russia, and China. So I think this would be a good idea. The U.S. would cut by 50%, we would cut by 50%, and then China would join if wanted. The Russian leader said that he couldn't speak for China, but said Moscow could come to an agreement with the United States. We're not against it, saying it was a good proposal, and we're ready for discussions about this. And again, the whole cutting by 50% seems unrealistic for a few reasons. The biggest one is I think it would be politically untenable in the United States. The U.S. military budget is like 8 times the size of Russia. And so if we each agree to cut our military budget in half, the U.S. would likely cut our military budget by a greater number than the Russian military budget starts at. Now, I think this could happen without risking the defense of the United States. Let me make that clear. However, I don't think there is a chance in hell that Congress would ever pass a spending bill, authorize a treaty that says that the Americans are going to cut our military budget by 50%. It just seems extremely unlikely and extremely politically untenable in the United States. However, I do think there's a possibility that Trump and Putin sit down, and this could be the framework of some kind of arms control agreement where we agree not to spend so much money on missiles, missile defense, nuclear weapons, bombers, fighter jets, and things like this, where It doesn't mean a drastic cut to the American military budget, but certain strategic weapons platforms would see their funding at least redirected, and that would be a positive step between Russia and China, or Russia and the United States, and maybe China. So I hope that this is positive, it moves in that direction. At the same time, Trump has also talked about making 5% the minimum spending level for NATO member countries. And if that happens, 5% GDP would have to be spent by each country on defense. Then it seems that this plan is less likely. And so we have kind of some dueling proposals from Donald Trump here on how to handle this situation. Now, one thing that does seem to be, when we talk about Trump and him just saying things, one of the things that he said was there's no problem with the European troop deployment to Ukraine. And Putin is saying that, oh, no, that's not the case. And so I think this is probably a good thing that Putin is just clarifying here. I didn't think that Russia would allow this, but it's important to remember that, we are still dealing with Donald Trump here, and him flip-flopping and talking off the cuff. Sometimes he gets things really wrong. Now, another story that makes me somewhat optimistic that a deal in Ukraine is going to get done is this one. Dave DeCamp wrote it for antiwar.com on the 24th. Trump says he's in serious discussions with Putin about a major U.S.-Russian economic deal. So Trump said Monday that he was in serious discussions with Putin about ending the war in Ukraine and the possibility of economic deals between the U.S. and Russia. So Trump wrote on Truth Social, I am in serious discussions with Putin of Russia concerning ending the war and also major economic development transactions, which will take place between the United States and Russia. And the reason that this, I think, is so important is because one of the things going on right now is that the U.S. and Ukraine are apparently working towards and may have gotten nearly completed a deal for the U.S. to get access to about $500 billion of Ukrainian minerals and other natural resources. I think one of the major obstacles and barriers to potentially ending the war in Ukraine at this point is that deal, because if Trump agrees to continue the flow of weapons to Ukraine, as long as there's a flow of minerals returning to the United States, then there's a possibility that the war keeps going for that reason. And I've been warning about this, I think, since November when Lindsey Graham first started discussing this, that I thought this was a real trap that Donald Trump could fall in. On top of it, if we do sign this deal with Ukraine and we do start to mine these minerals and things like that, well, what happens when the security of those mines come into question? How much defense would the U.S. add to Ukraine in order to defend our economic investments, what are now our natural resources in Ukraine? I think this could be something that ends up with Trump doubling down on the war in Ukraine just to protect the minerals that he has now signed and believes that he owns. Now, there's a lot of questions about the U.S. Ukrainian mineral deal, such as, is it going to pay the U.S. back for aid already given to Ukraine, or is it going to simply be for future aid? Now, maybe the best situation for the Ukrainians is that if Kiev is going to sell off their natural resources, at least they get some money to rebuild their country in return, rather than just more and more weapons. All right, next up here, U.S. votes against UN resolution condemning Russia for Ukraine war. This is another positive sign. So the U.S. and Russia were among 18 nations that voted against the Ukrainian drafted resolution at the UN General Assembly that condemned Moscow and called for a Russian withdrawal from Ukraine on the third anniversary of the Russian invasion. The resolution passed 93-18, with 65 countries abstaining from the voting. The U.S. introduced its own resolution that simply called for peace in Ukraine, but European countries were able to add amendments that asserted anti-Russian language. After the amendment was added, the U.S. abstained from voting, and the resolution passed 93-80 8 with 73 abstentions. So in remarks to the United Nations, the U.S. Ambassador Dorothy Shea referred to the Russian invasion of Ukraine as an escalation of the Russia-Ukraine war and said the conflict started 11 years ago, referring to when war broke out in Ukraine following the U.S.-backed coup in 2014 that ousted former President Viktor Yanukovych. The language from Shea marks a significant shift from the Biden administration, which always referred to the Russian invasion as unprovoked and, a unique and evil threat to the world. All right, moving over to the Middle East where we got some bad news. Israeli officials say Gaza ceasefire deal on brink of collapse due to Netanyahu's hardened stance. So the Gaza hostage and ceasefire deal is on the brink of collapse due to Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu hardening his stance, an Israeli source told the Israeli news outlet Walla. So Netanyahu has delayed the release of over 600 Palestinians who were supposed to be freed from Israeli jails in exchange for 6 Israeli hostages released by Hamas last Saturday. Netanyahu said he postponed the release over Hamas's humiliating handover ceremonies. Under the agreement, Hamas is due to release 4 bodies of Israeli hostages on Thursday, the last release under phase 1 of the deal. The Israeli source speaking with Walla said that Hamas agreed that the release of the 4 bodies could be done in private without any ceremony, but Netanyahu has hardened his stance further, informing mediators that Hamas's commitment was not enough and that Israel would only release more than 600 Palestinians once it received the bodies. So the Israeli official said, unfortunately, there are people in the government who are more interested in Hamas's ceremonies than they are in returning civilians for burial in Israel. The first phase of the ceasefire will expire Saturday, March 1st, and Israel has refused to engage in real negotiations on the second phase. The U.S., which backed Netanyahu's decision to delay the release of Palestinians, is now suggesting that phase 1 of the deal could be extended. Under the initial deal, all remaining Israeli hostages were supposed to be released in phase 2 in exchange for an Israeli withdrawal from Gaza. Hamas recently offered to release all the Israeli captives in one go if Israel would agree to a permanent ceasefire in Gaza and complete withdrawal, but Netanyahu is now demanding Hamas be disarmed and removed from Gaza, so adding new conditions so a deal cannot get done. Next up here, we have another Israeli official going on a genocidal rant. This is the deputy speaker of the Israeli Knesset, and he has called for all adult men in Gaza to be killed in the latest example of genocidal rhetoric from an Israeli official. He said on Kol Baham radio, who is innocent in Gaza? Civilians went out and slaughtered people in cold blood. We need to separate the children and women and kill all adults in Gaza. We are being too considerate. So he is a member of Benjamin Netanyahu's Likud party and referred to Palestinians in Gaza as subhumans and scoundrels and said no one in the world wants to take them in. He explained the international community understands that the residents of Gaza are not welcome anywhere and is pushing them towards Israel. The deputy speaker also said the city of Jenin in the occupied West Bank will soon be turned into Gaza as Israel is ramping up its assault there. He said the Palestinians being freed from Israeli jails as a part of the Gaza hostage and ceasefire deal should be put in Jenin so they could be eliminated later on. Erase Jenin. Don't start looking for the terrorist. If there's a terrorist in the house, take him down. Tell the women and children to get out. Last year, so that was a quote from the deputy speaker. So last year, he said there are no innocents in Gaza and called for the entire place to be burned down so Israeli soldiers wouldn't get hurt. What does it mean to burn? Go in and rip them apart. There should be no thoughts, no considerations. The soldiers of the IDF should not think for 1 second and be hurt because we need to be humane. Such rhetoric from Israeli officials has been cited in South Africa's genocide case against Israel at the International Court of Justice to demonstrate Israel's intent to commit genocide. And these statements have just come time after time after time throughout this entire conflict. All right, last story up here today. 6 Palestinian infants died due to cold in Gaza as Israel continues to block shelters from entering the Strip. So, at least 6 Palestinian infants have died in Gaza due to a cold spell as Israel continues to largely block the entrance of tents and mobile homes to the Strip despite agreeing to do so as a part of the hostage and ceasefire deal. According to Al Jazeera, Gaza's civil defense recorded the deaths of 6 newborns due to the cold and lack of heating over the past week. Dr. Saeed Salah, the director of the Patient Friend Benevolent Society Hospital in Gaza City, said his facility had received 8 cases of severe hypothermia, which required intensive care. Hospitals were also struggling to deal with the cases due to Israel's war on Gaza's medical infrastructure. The doctor explained, "We appealed to the relevant authorities to provide caravans, tents, and fuel to ensure warmth for our people and protect children, especially with the arrival of a new low-pressure system." So Hamas said in a statement that the deaths were a result of Israel's criminal policies and called for pressure on Israel to allow entry of more shelters into Gaza and other humanitarian aid. Thousands of mobile homes are still stranded at the Rafah border crossing, awaiting permission from Israel to enter Gaza. According to Middle East Eye, a medical official said 35,000 families in Gaza are facing severe shortages of basic supplies, including blankets, tents, and heating devices. The deaths due to the cold in Gaza come amid uncertainty over whether the hostage and ceasefire deal will continue to hold, as the first phase is set to expire on Saturday. Israel has also continued to violate the truce by bombing and shooting Palestinians, killing more than 100 since the ceasefire went into effect on January 19th. So, just awful news coming out of Gaza, even if it looks like we may have some chance to end the war in Ukraine sometime soon. All right, everybody, that will do it for the show today. Thank you all so much for tuning in. Remember, I will be live with a new episode of the Kyle Anzalone Show today about 4:45, so be sure to tune into that. If you haven't already, subscribe to the YouTube channel for the Kyle Anzalone Show. It's the first link in the show notes page, so very easy to find. And if you're still listening to the show and you really like the work I do, consider donating to the Libertarian Institute. Thanks, everyone.